Hello and welcome to the Guildhall in the City of London for the Booker Prize 2000. This year the award ceremony is bigger than ever and noisier than ever, with over 500 guests of Booker dining well and, like the rest of us, waiting to hear who's won the most public literary prize in this country. The winner will be announced in about 45 minutes' time. The buzz is that the competition is wide open. The shortlist contains 2 familiar names and 4 relative newcomers, but the chairman of the judges, journalist Simon Jenkins, has repeatedly stated that the Booker is not a prize for lifetime achievement, but simply for the best novel of the year. Canadian writer Margaret Atwood is the Booker's favourite. This is the second time she's been shortlisted, and her novel, The Blind Assassin, a family saga which spans the 20th century, is considered by some to be one of her finest works. Brian O'Doherty is the oldest of the shortlisted authors at 72, but one of the new voices on the list. The Deposition of Father McGreevy about the decline of an Irish village was plucked from obscurity by the judges. The novel is from a small independent publisher and had an initial print run of only 2,000 copies. Trezza Azzopardi is another new face. The Hiding Place is her first novel, and it deals with hardships of a Maltese family growing up in Cardiff in the 1960s. This book was added to the list by the judges, even though it was not one of the 120 books they were required to read. Matthew Kneale's 4th book, English Passengers, has the look of a classic Booker winner. It's an historical yarn set in the 19th century about an expedition to Tasmania and the destruction of the Aboriginal people. Michael Collins is an Irishman living in the United States. His novel, The Keepers of Truth, is a murder mystery set in the depressed industrial heartlands of the American Midwest. Some people have claimed that its American subject matter breaks the rules of the Booker, but the man himself is strictly kosher. Finally, Kazuo Ishiguro has already won the prize with The Remains of the Day in 1989. His new book, When We Were Orphans, is a search for identity among the ruins of 1930s Shanghai. Those are the contenders. Now I'm going downstairs to the crypt to discuss the novels with our own panel of judges, leaving events up here in the very capable hands of Muriel Gray.
Thank you, Melvin. Well, if there's one thing we can say for sure about the first Booker of the new millennium, it's that the fashion is for fiction which looks to the past. All 6 of the novels are historical. So does this mean that our writers are still trying to shake off the 20th or even the 19th centuries? Well, I stopped some of the guests as they were coming in to ask them for their views on the shortlist.
I'm not sure if it's a massive millennial moment or not, really. I have to say that I'm a big fan of historical novels myself, so I vote for them every time. But no, it is surprising that there's been not more variety on the shortlist. But as I say, I'm thoroughly pleased because it gets to indulge my own personal preference. So
that's the English novel. That's how it is. That's how it's been for a long time.
There's lots of people writing about contemporary life. I think that a few feel have been left off this year's shortlist, as they do.
I'm saying that because I'm writing an historical novel myself, so I'm trying to defend it. It's time we had more historical novels, I suddenly discover.
Well, I think a lot of credit, especially in awards, is given to novels that are kind of telegrams from another time, that are given credit for reconstructing another time. And the problem with that is I kind of think history books can do that. But I might be talking out of my arse because I haven't read any of them, so they could be great and they could really say something about today.
Yeah, but War and Peace was historical when it came out. I mean, it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. It just matters whether the books tell you something interesting about human beings that you want to know.
I think anything, I mean, this is a bit trite, but I think anything that helps publicise books is a good thing, and the Booker certainly does that. They get loads of publicity. The press tomorrow morning will be full of it, as well as the elections and the Chancellor's pre-budget statement, so that's a good thing.
Great. Well, clear your plate, because Gordon Ramsay's cooking tonight, and he'll give you a row if you don't.
That's a good reason for coming, isn't it?
No, if I did have a chance to read all these shortlisted, trust me, then my food would start deteriorating. Weekends, I'm going to start, but I'm still trying to catch up from last year's.
Well, that's what some of the guests here in the Guildhall think. But before we join Melvin and his own expert panel of judges, let's remind ourselves what kind of a year 2000 has been in the world of books.
J.K. Rowling struck a blow for single mothers this year. Resisting the temptations of a benefit cheque and a high-rise council flat, Rowling published the 4th Harry Potter book and broke records by selling nearly 400,000 copies in the first day. The champion of single mothers has now sold an incredible 57 million books worldwide. Stephen King sent a chill down the spine of publishers everywhere by releasing his latest novel in instalments on the internet. King said he would only keep writing if subscribers paid $1 for each chapter. Well, perhaps the same scheme could be applied in reverse to Jeffrey Archer, where subscribers could pay £1 per chapter to stop him from writing them. The Nobel Prize for Literature went to Chinese dissident novelist Gao Jingzhan for his book Soul Mountain, a novel so obscure you can't buy it in any bookshop in Britain. The author has been criticised by feminists for his obsession with Chinese peasants' bottoms. On the subject of bottoms, this year's hottest young author, Zadie Smith, announced that she'd rather not win the £30,000 Orange Prize for her shortlisted novel White Teeth, because one of the judges was the wife of William Hague. Offended by his stance on asylum seekers, Smith said that Fionn Hague could kiss my behind. Winner of the Booker of Bookers and veteran party animal Salman Rushdie moved to New York this year and declared the London literary scene backbiting and incestuous. No doubt he's looking forward to a new stateside career continuing to state the obvious. The year 2000 also saw a fashion for novels by comedians and a manifesto for austerity amongst serious writers. But perhaps the year's most remarkable achievement was that of veteran American novelist Saul Bellow, who proved that his creative juices are still flowing by fathering a child at the age of 84. Seems it was worth him spending the money on a word processor that had that extra RAM.
Down here in the Guildhall crypt, I'm joined by three novelists who between them are going to select their own winner for the prize. Alain de Botton is the author of How Proust Can Change Your Life. He recently presented a Channel 4 series on philosophy. Bonnie Greer is an American novelist and playwright living in Britain. She's the author of Hanging by Her Teeth. Ian Rankin is a successful crime writer famous for his creation of Inspector Rebus. We're going to have our own judging process to see if we can arrive at a clear winner. And we're going to start by looking at Kazuo Ishiguro. Bonnie Greer, what's your view of this book about English detective 1930s going back to Shanghai?
Well, that's actually not what it's about, Melvin. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I loved it because of the fact that, first of all, it is more than that. It's a book about the human condition. It's a book about the way we...
It's also a book about an English detective.
It is about an English detective, it is, but I think you can get caught up in thinking you're reading a detective story. It isn't, because there are devices that actually don't work. He rises above that and gives us a novel that is actually a meditation on the human condition. Now, he's done this before. He's written a lot about uptight Englishmen who don't know what's going on, that kind of thing, and maybe he's done it better. But I think that he's a master at what he does, because like a blues singer, he takes a certain amount of words and he uses them quite exquisitely, and I just think he's absolutely magnificent.
Sorry. And Matthew Kneale's English Passengers.
When We Were Orphans is a novel about this irrational part of people that believes you can always go back and fix something that got broken way back then, perhaps way back in childhood, that it's never too late to recover things that in reality have been lost forever. So in this case you have a little boy, Christopher. His parents disappear in Shanghai when he's 10 years old. He's brought up by aunts and in boarding school in England, and he becomes a famous detective in London, but he's always haunted by this idea that yes, he should go back to Shanghai and his parents will somehow still be there.
It was during the period shortly after the Mannering case, when I was undertaking some research into the background of those years I spent in Shanghai. I believe I have mentioned this research before, much of which I conducted in the British Museum. It was also my intention to prepare my ground for the day I began in earnest my investigations into the whole affair concerning my parents, which, despite the continuing efforts of the Shanghai police, has remained unresolved to this day. In any case, as I say, I spent a good many hours in the British Museum a few years ago gathering material on the complex political situation in Shanghai at that time. I did also, at various points, write off letters to China seeking information unavailable to me in London. So it was that I received one day a yellowed cutting taken from the North China Daily News. My correspondent had sent me an article about changes to trading regulations in the concession ports, which no doubt I had requested, but it was the photograph which happened to be on the reverse side that immediately captured my attention. It shows 3 men in a leafy avenue standing in front of a grand motor car. All 3 are Chinese. The plump man in the center is in traditional Chinese dress, a dark gown, cap and pigtail. As with most newspaper photographs of the time, there is a stagey, posed feeling to it. Nevertheless, from the moment my glance first fell on it, the picture, or more precisely, the central figure in the dark gown, has been a source of exceptional interest to me.
English Passengers is about a Victorian English vicar who sets out with an expedition to find the Garden of Eden, which, for reasons known only to himself, he's decided lies on the island of Tasmania, near Australia. Also on the expedition is a surgeon who's coming up with some very sinister racial theories, which are in many ways a precursor to Hitler's Mein Kampf. The other part of the book deals with the island of Tasmania itself and the destruction of the Aboriginal culture there.
The Aborigines, who had comprised some 200, were now reduced to half that number. Little by little, the settlement began to acquire an aura of sombre emptiness, only the graveyard remaining busy. There was inevitably much talk as to the reasons for this decline. The settlement surgeon cited purely practical causes, such as the blacks' lack of exposure to European diseases. I, and others too, perceived a greater force at work, however. If the Aborigines had only shown greater reverence for the scriptures, I had no doubt that the good Lord would have been moved to protect them from suffering. I could not help but feel that they were reaping the reward for what was in truth their own betrayal of Mr. Robson. Had he not risked his own life and health to rescue them from the wilderness? Had he not devoted his every waking hour to their improvement, bringing them new knowledge and even new names? They had returned his kindness only with indolence and unconcern. Poor Mr. Robson was much affected by the natives' decline, and with each new death his sadness became a little more marked. In spite of this, he never allowed himself to lose his determination. If we cannot save them in one way, then we must endeavour to save them in another.
Ian, I jumped a gun a bit there with Bonnie Gray. Ian Rankin, what did you make of this story, which in one sense is about a gentleman detective of the 1930s?
Well, of course, I was very pleased to see a detective novel on the shortlist, naturally, but I wasn't convinced by the detective. We've gone from the remains of the day to the remains of the parents with this book, really. You either are seduced by Ishiguro's narrative voice or you're frustrated by it. I find it very bridled. I just wish he would loosen his stays a little bit now and again. I didn't find the detective himself very convincing. You see him with a magnifying glass poring over the remains of an 18-month-old murder scene. I'm not sure he was going to get much from that. You don't get to see him doing too much investigating. And when it does actually go back to Shanghai, it gets very melodramatic and edges start to blur. And although the pace picks up, I just was not convinced.
Alain de Botton?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite fair to sort of pick up the book for not being a proper detective novel. It's rather like saying sort of Andy Warhol doesn't look, proper, the perspective is wrong or something. That's clearly not what he's doing. I think it's a wonderful book, completely mesmerizing. I'd never read an Ishiguro book before, and I was completely seduced by the voice. It's a very dry voice. It's rather like a very dry cake, which you begin eating, you think, I don't know if I like this, and by the end you're sort of eating the whole thing. It's got that Moorish quality. You reach the end of every page, and you think, I'm going to just turn the other page. So I was surprised, but I liked it a lot.
I agree with Ellen. I think what is incredible about it as well is that, for instance, when we go back to Shanghai and he uses he talks about being young, he in fact actually doesn't talk about it. He creates the sentences in such a way that I had the sense of looking at Shanghai from a knee-high position. I had the sense of looking at it from a child's point of view. I think that's absolutely masterful. And he begins the first paragraph, for instance, talking about England, and then he brings up the fact that in England you always see a bit of green. And it's that kind of studied, slow elegance that goes completely through the book that I thought was riveting.
And I didn't, and by the end I thought, well, he's actually hoisting his own petard, because of course he does try and stick to the structure of the detective novel, which means he has this scene at the end where the baddie has to be revealed and have this very long scene explaining everything that's gone before, including white slavery and drug gang lords, opium gang lords whipping young women and stuff. And I felt none of that was convincing.
OK, we'll turn to English Passengers by Matthew Kneale. Alan, what's your view of that?
Well, I was rather daunted. A huge historical novel, many voices. One thinks the typical Booker winner, and that's actually rather an insult. But I was surprised that...
Are you prepared to take on the 30-odd typical Booker winners?
Anyway, I think, you know, the historical novels of a very fat kind have given the Booker, in the past, a slightly bad name. I'm happy to say that many of the voices in this novel, I think, work tremendously well. The voice of the captain, the Manx captain, is a fantastic comic creation. However, you know, if I really wanted to give this book to a good friend, I'd want to shave off about 200 pages from it. It's much too long. It gets overburdened. So there's a lot of comic talent, but it's also trying to introduce too many weighty themes.
There were a lot of voices, Bonnie. How did you get on with the voices? Do you think they were differentiated enough?
No, not at all, and that's my main problem with it. There's something that Saul Bellow says is called a facts and figures kind of writer. We've got enormous, stories about the ship and all of this sort of thing, but yet we're being told this story through these different voices, and you have to be able to actually be seduced by those voices because they're talking directly to you. There is no differentiation, and very, very little, and the differentiation...
I think it's unfair to say there's no differentiation.
Well, there's very little, Melvin. I mean, what is in there are things like double negatives or past, historic type of voices. It just didn't work, and it actually made it seem longer, unfortunately, than it really, really was.
What's your take on this, Ian?
Well, if they gave the Booker Prize for ambition, I think this book would win hands down. I think it shows terrific scope, breadth, a love of language, a love of narrative, a love of storytelling. And I think sometimes the Booker Prize should take these into account. I do agree that there were too many voices. If he'd been more confident, he would maybe have realised that he only needed one or two people. In fact, the captain on the ship would have carried the whole book, I think.
Kneale.
Kneale, I think it was absolutely superb. And it was, yes, and it was almost like Moby Dick. You know, whenever you went off the ship, I just wanted you to get back onto the ship to get some of the action.
It would have been a great book if it was like Moby Dick.
A novella narrated by the captain
exactly,
would have been fantastic.
And,
well, I didn't think it had to go down quite as much as that, but it could have done with, as you say, a little bit of shaving, perhaps. But I still a rollicking good read. I really, got into it. I don't like history novels as a rule. At times it reminded me of John Fowles, a kind of English comic John Fowles.
There was a reach. I mean, he was talking about the only known complete genocide in history of the Aborigines in Tasmania. He was talking about trying to disprove that the scientific idea of the development of the world was wrong, or Vicar would not approve it. He was taking on, I agree with Ian that he was extremely ambitious. Now that's one thing, whether it's any...
Although I think in a way, I would credit him for making, because ambition has that thing, it sounds rather worthy. An ambitious novel, one thinks, oh dear, this is going to be painful. I think to his credit, he takes on big themes, and actually you don't feel that they're that big. They gradually grow, and that is, I think, the skill of a good novelist, that you gradually feel the import of something.
But we're also in a time when it's believed that we need a lot of facts and figures to make a book work, and that's the problem with it, really.
Well, we'll be back in a few minutes to talk about two more novels in the running for the Booker Prize 2000.
welcome back to the Booker Prize 2000 from the Guildhall in London. The judges have now made their decision and we're less than half an hour away from hearing the announcement of the winner. The announcement will be made by the chairman of the judges, journalist Simon Jenkins, who steers the whole process but only casts a vote if the rest of the judges are divided. Well, this year the judges are Roy Foster, Professor of Irish History at Oxford and biographer of the poet W.B. Yeats, novelist Rose Tremain, who was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1989 for her novel Restoration, Caroline Gascoigne, literary editor of the Sunday Times, and broadcaster and journalist Mariella Frostrup, who's taking time out from her lovely Gordon Ramsay starter to join me. Mariella, it's a very interesting shortlist this year, all historical, nothing contemporary. What does that tell us more about the judges' tastes?
Well, I think it depends what you call contemporary. You know, I mean, the Margaret Atwood novel, for example, is set in 1999, and it's an older woman looking back on 100 years of history. The Michael Collins novel, Keepers of Truth, is set in the sort of very middle 80s. So again, you know, I mean, I would say that's fairly contemporary. I think that what we did was we tried to choose the best books we could find, and I'm very happy with the shortlist.
Was there a punch-up? Be honest.
No, there was no punch-up for the shortlist.
How about the winner? Was there a punch-up?
There was no punch-up, but there was dissension. But I mean, I think that that's healthy. You know, the whole point of the Booker Prize is that it's a sort of democratic decision. And, you know, if everyone sits around and agrees all the time, then you're not going to come up with the best book.
Can you really be objective, though? Do you just bring your pet authors and your pet prejudices and loves and likes to this?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't think the shortlist included any of our pet authors. There were 2 first-time novelists for a start on it, so we would have had to be psychic. I think that it's hard. I think the hardest thing probably is with established authors not to look back at the body of their work. But you just have to try and be professional about it.
So you try and avoid that lifetime awards type of prize, eh?
Well, yeah, or comparing the book of this year with their book of 3 years ago, which you may have preferred.
Okay, and more importantly, how was the Gordon Ramsay starter?
Well, I wish I could tell you. I haven't been able to touch it yet, and I'm dying for a snack.
Go back to it, Mariella. Thank you very much. Now back to our own panel of judges with Melvyn Bragg in the crypt.
We're going to look at 2 more of the contenders, Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin and Michael Collins' The Keepers of Truth. But first, here some...
The Blind Assassin is about 2 sisters, Iris and Laura Chase. In 1945, Laura has driven a car off a bridge, and Iris, now 82, is telling the story behind this tragedy and also behind the publication of The Blind Assassin, which is a novel. Within the novel,
I've wrapped myself in a shawl in order to sit outside. Laid out in front of me are a cup of tea, an apple cut into quarters, and a pad of paper with blue lines on it, like men's pajamas once. I've bought a new pen as well, a cheap one. I remember my first fountain pen. How sleek it felt. The year was 1929. I was 13. Laura borrowed this pen, without asking, as she borrowed everything, and then broke it, effortlessly. I forgave her, of course. I always did. I had to, because there were only the 2 of us. The 2 of us on our thorn-encircled island, waiting for rescue. For whom am I writing this? For myself? I think not. For some stranger in the future, after I'm dead? I have no such ambition. Perhaps I write for no one. I'm not as swift as I was. My fingers are stiff and clumsy. The pen wavers and rambles. It takes me a long time to form the words. And yet I persist, hunched over, as if sewing by moonlight.
The Keepers of Truth is a murder mystery / psychological portrait of America in the late 70s, set in a small town in the Midwest, and it's about a dismemberment murder and also about the breakdown of American culture, the death of the car industry. So the main protagonist is a reporter who follows a suspect called Ronnie Lawton, who works at a Denny's diner, and he's accused of chopping up his father.
I drove toward the bleeding strip of neon, seeing the small drive-in windows, glass tombs encasing high school dropouts, mostly young girls, some male misfits. the dim of mind all banished to the night shift for minimum wage. It was this new destiny of strip malls and eateries that scared the shit out of me, that made me wince and understand why people kill each other. I just stared into that benign warfare of 24-hour fronts, the lights that never shut off. You have to ask yourself, why do they do it? What compels people to go on existing on the dark side of night? What does it do to the psyche to know this is your future, your destiny in darkness, the graveyard shift at the drive-thru? This was Ronnie Lawton's domain. Ex-Army enlistee, decommissioned into society. A monstrous figure in a white chef's hat. Short order cook, with an expertise in munitions and assault rifles, trained to survive in the wilderness. Scrambling eggs, making shakes, salting fries. Along these strips of neon were the killing fields of our post-industrialism.
Right, we'll talk about Margaret Atwood's book first. Alain de Botton, The Blind Assassin. Quite a complicated book. Margaret Atwood just began to indicate it. What did you make of the complication first and then the book?
The complication, well, I mean, the book begins tremendously so. I think we noticed in that excerpt, I mean, I was certainly slightly falling asleep, and for the first 150 pages, this was excruciatingly painful. I'd never read a Margaret Atwood book, and I vowed that I would never read another one again. This really was painful. However, then it started to pick up. That is a problem. I think it's very demanding on the reader to say, we're going to give you 150 pages where it's an old lady looking back over her life. You're not quite sure who she is. You're not quite sure what is going on. And I think, you know, I'm all for a bit of
Names
murkiness.
are not appended to dialogue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm all for a bit of murkiness in a novel, but I think at some level, as a novelist, you have to think about the pleasure of your reader. And Margaret Atwood, for the first 150 pages, just doesn't do it. She doesn't care. It's almost a kind of rudeness. It's saying, you know, my story is more important, whether you understand it or not, I don't care. So I felt sort of slightly insulted by that. That said, it does start to pick up. It's got some very weighty themes. It's got a rather moving look at the position of women, I think. The very limited opportunities open to women in Canadian society after the war, just before the war, after the war. So I think in that sense, it does get moving. And by the end, I was quite glad to have read it and wanted to go back to the beginning. But I just think, I mean, it's rather like eating, I don't know, bran flakes or something. You know it's good for you, but it's really tough going. And I wonder whether the price is really worth paying.
Ian?
And you've then got to go to the toilet afterwards.
Exactly.
It's a sprawling family saga. It's a history of 20th century Canada. It has a naive young woman from a well-to-do family who marries a rich, older industrialist who has a scheming sister. It's basically the plot of every Channel 5 movie in the afternoon you've ever seen. But it's Margaret Atwood, so she does wonderful things with it. There are beautiful descriptions, there are lovely moments, and I liked the stuff in the old lady's life. I thought was some of the best writing in it, when she's looking back and when she's confronted by this society which has become kind of, I don't know, mechanised, and where it's kind of ye olde sweet shop that she has to go to, or candy shop or whatever that she goes to for her sustenance. I had trouble with a lot of it. I had trouble with the sci-fi. I'm surprised you didn't mention the science fiction.
There's a science fiction book running through it.
As soon as I see the words, you know, the natives of Saskio-Norn were the Blibs or the Zobs or something, I then start switching off straight away. And I had big difficulties with this because it seemed to really not have anything to do with the main story and didn't really tell me much more about the characters.
You mentioned at the beginning that this book was complicated. It is complicated, but it's not complex, and that's the problem with it. Each of those stories, the outer space story that the lovers tell one another, and the novel within the novel that's being read, are or should actually feed one another. They should
and all the stuff from the local
exactly,
papers
in
as
the
well.
papers. They should contradict one another so that you as the reader create the narrative. What Atwood does is, unlike Italo Calvino or Borges, for instance, is she uses those stories to illustrate her main story, which is rather pedestrian. It's about a bunch of sisters growing up in Canada. At the end of it, I agree, she's very good on the elderly lady. It's a very moving portrait, but there's about 200 pages that she could have done without. She uses those devices to illustrate the book, and that's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely wrong.
We'll turn to The Keepers of Truth by Michael Collins. Staying with you, Bonnie, it's set in America. What did you make of this?
I really hated this book. I cannot understand why it's on the list, except because the guy's got an Irish passport, I suppose.
No, it's on the list because the judges think it's
well,
one of the best six novels that they read. That's why it's on the list.
I'm trying to understand, you know, because it is a book that has nothing to do with of the Commonwealth of Britain. It's not a take on anything. The voice is a kind of sub Elmore Leonard. We've seen this character before. It's an attempt to write the great American novel. It's got all the hallmarks in it, this sort of convoluted language. Plato runs through it, but what is Plato doing in this book? I just thought it was horrific, and I really, really detested it. It's sort of like the kind of novel that you write in writing class for an MA program, and then your teacher says, right, lovely, you got that out of your system, now let's go back and write. It's completely phony as well. Where does this thing take place?
Just a second. As you said, Plato, Alain's ears lit up, but as you were talking at the beginning, Ian was actually growling.
I heard him growling. Yes, I heard him. I wanted him to growl.
Yeah, this was my favourite. This was the book I enjoyed reading most out of the 6 books. I'm a sucker for books about the American dream, or how terrible it is in America anyway. And this really was James Ellroy out of Jane Ann Phillips, if you ask me. I thought it was a terrific book. It was full of punchy dialogue. It had sort of real verve and zing to it. It had a love of language. It had this extraordinarily irritating narrator who I'm sure was supposed to be irritating. Every sentence of his had to be perfectly formed, and he was speaking in philosophical sentences most of the time. Very bizarre. It had a queasy misogyny in it, which I wasn't so sure about. But I did like it. I mean, I'm a sucker for books about the American dream, and I thought it was beautifully done, the way that the symbolism came in. I mean, this is an America that doesn't produce things anymore. It doesn't manufacture things except noise.
The setting is very powerful, and we know about this in Britain, an industrial area, totally blighted, people who were used to very hard daily work and skills gone, a wreckage of an entire civilization.
And sitting there in a mansion that's based on a fortune made from refrigerators, with the zoo next door, from which the animal noises keep intruding, and just like my growl, in fact.
As Ian describes it, I try and remember whether it's the same book. I mean, I agree with you. You've described some lovely things. If only it was that novel. Exactly. I mean, this kind of American urban alienation, the Rust Bowl, etc. I love all those themes. You know, I love sitting in lonely diners in wrecked places, and you know, I love the atmosphere. This atmosphere didn't come through in Michael Collins at all. So it's one of these things where the themes, if on paper, it looks fantastic. You know, when you meet it in the flesh, it just doesn't. It didn't work for me at all.
It's nice to see another crime novel, of course, on the shortlist.
What did you think about the reflections, Alain? I mean, because one of the things that the narrator comes up front with says, I'm a reporter, but what I'd really like to do is to talk about, literally, Einstein, Plato, while I'm investigating this.
I would have loved, I love the idea of a narrator with zany theories and, you know, philosophy, and, you know, nice to see a book on the shortlist with some philosophy in it. But that said, I don't think that the philosophy was really zany enough. I mean, you have to look to Thomas Pynchon to really find great American zany theorists, and this was not Thomas Pynchon at all. So I thought it was remarkably tame. In fact, it sounded like a sort of a Midwestern journalist talking, and that was not particularly strange.
Briefly, Bonnie.
And it's not sharp enough. It doesn't actually bring up the differences in American society. It's sharp enough. You're not quite sure where you are with this book. That's the problem.
Sorry, what about the ending as a crime writer yourself? Did you think that worked?
Endings are notoriously difficult. I think it was... I'm allowed to say that, aren't I?
Well, we'll have to leave you on that. Have to leave you on that. We'll be back shortly to talk about the last 2 novels on the shortlist and to discover who the winner is. If you want, I can spend a little less time on this. I mean, I don't see... collected itself together. This furlong, don't you? Okay, we're going to start with The Hiding Place, and the second one is McGreevy. Then I'm going to ask you who your winners are, and they do their winner, and then we come back to us saying what do we think, and so on and so forth.
Well, welcome back to London's Guildhall. We're only a few minutes away from discovering who's the winner of the Booker Prize 2000. With me is Graham Sharp from William Hill, the bookmakers. Very relevant because, Graham, people have been putting money on it. Where's the money lying?
Well, they've been back in the fillies. Margaret Atwood and Trezza Azzopardi have emerged as the punters' fancies. Margaret Atwood 2-1 favourite. Azzopardi down from 7-1 to 3-1, so the springer in the market. They're well fancied.
I'm quite interested about what kind of person books, you know, puts a bet on the Booker. Do you have all these college professors coming in and pushing the punters aside?
There's definitely people with an interest in and possibly a vested interest in the publishing. Definitely, I think they like to see their contenders as one of the leading fancies. So we do see a certain amount of PR support possibly for the books, and of course people who've read one or more of them and who think, yeah, I enjoyed that book, I'll have a couple of quid on it to win the Booker.
It's not your normal punter, is it, really?
It's not the man that bets on the 2:30 at Sandown or the Grand National of the World Cup, no.
How about yourself as a betting man? Where would you have put the money?
If I were forced to have a bet this time around, I'd back Michael Collins. That was the one book that I genuinely enjoyed this time out.
Good stuff. Well, we'll just have to wait to see who's won. Back to Melvin, back in the crypt.
Okay, we're now going to talk about the final two novels in the list. Trezza Azzopardi's The Hiding Place and Brian O'Doherty's The Deposition of Father McGreevy. But first, here are the films.
The Hiding Place is about a Welsh Maltese family living in Tiger Bay in the 1960s. The story is told by Dolores, the youngest of 6 daughters, as she describes her father Frankie's compulsive gambling.
Tonight, Salvatore wants to watch. Here we have my father, the giant Martineau, Ilya the Pole, and crooked Joe Medora. This pack of men is busy. Sal! Telephone! Says Joe, not looking up. Salvatore rolls reluctantly downstairs. Joe Medora wears a slouch hat, a silk scarf anchored at the neck, a Savile Row suit. He's an archetypal villain who makes sure he looks the part. He angles his cigar into the side of his lipless mouth, staring over his hand. He's seen all the films. No gesture is wasted. He is patient. It's my father's move. Jack of hearts, 5 of clubs, 4 winking diamonds. It's a boy! Cries Salvatore, beating back upstairs. Bambino, Frankie! And my father, who is Frankie Bambina to his friends, twists recklessly with joy. And loses the cafe, the shoebox under the floorboards, full with big money, his own father's ruby ring, and my mother's white lace gown to Joe Medora. At least I have a son, he thinks, as he rolls the ring across the worn green felt.
If I wanted to write a rural novel, there are very few rural novels that I think catch the very nature of that experience. It's past, it's gone. And I also wanted an unlikely hero, a priest, who was a good man, who had tasks to deal with that proved impossible for him to handle. I also wanted to, as they say nowadays, elegantly foreground the language. That's the Irish language, a language which was my father's first language and for which I have a special affection. Things end up badly, as they do generally in most things in life, but along the way I hope there's some entertainment, amusement, and serious thoughts.
It was the terrible winter of '39, only 2 years ago, but it seems an age that began it, as you well know. Buried in snow we were. We never saw another soul but ourselves from dawn till dusk. But the calamity the Lord visited upon us passes understanding. It was Mariella who went first, the only fiery head among all those dark ones. We put her by the hob for the heat, and she died there where she'd spent most of her waking hours. The cold was such you could hear your own bones clicking against each other. We kept the fire burning as best we could. The turf was so sodden it gave out more smoke than heat. Not a one of us could tell what was wrong with her, except that she couldn't breathe right. I'll never forget the terrible look of concentration on her face, trying to keep the spark of life going. Near the end, she didn't know Morris, her husband, at all, though he never left her. The women gave her inhalations of honey and spirits, though where they got the honey is a mystery. It's easy to say now they stayed too close to her. Both she and the fire died in the night, and no sooner was she stiff and cold than one of the other women complained of a pain in her side that wouldn't leave her.
Okay, well, these are the last two novels we're discussing. Ian Rankin, we're starting with Azzopardi's novel, The Hiding Place. She's to be congratulated, and the novel was called in. It wasn't one of the 120 submitted. It's a first novel. So what do you make of it?
I'm very loath to say bad things about first novels, but it has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, so here goes. Right from the start, this irritated me. The actual layout of the paragraphs irritated me. The fact that some of them are indented and some of them start at the edge of the page. The present tense voice I didn't much like. And it seemed a very pedestrian book and lacking in ambition after the previous books that I'd read. I read this quite late on in the series of 6. It seemed very lacking in ambition. It was very much like a kitchen sink drama. It seemed to be a very old-fashioned kind of book. And I was actually surprised to find that she came out of a creative writing course, because to me it smacked of the opposite. It smacked of somebody who still thought of writing books as being episodes of Coronation Street, you know, and Ina Sharples is still alive and well.
There were episodes of Coronation Street which are extremely well written.
Of course there are, but not the ones with Ina Sharples in from the 60s. I mean, it almost was in black and white. You were reading this book in black and white, I felt. And I didn't get much sense, you know, it's the Maltese community in Cardiff, and I didn't get much sense of a tension between the Maltese community and the Welsh community, or the locals, the natives as it were, or any sense of life outside the Maltese community either, which I thought was rather strange with these young girls who I thought at that time in the 60s would actually be trying to branch out from their family to that other world.
The only thing that I disagree with Ian is that it's very much a writing school book. It's all about technique. We have first-person narrative, we have first-person something else, I think it's the book, then third person comes in. They're juxtaposed against one another, and sometimes you don't even know who's talking and why they're talking. And it mars a fairly tiny story and entombs it in technique. And it's very much the kind of book that someone who studied lots of writers writes. I was quite surprised it was on the short list as well, because it is very much a first novel in a negative sense. It is the novel that you get out of yourself to show that you've read other people. I was grateful for this look into the community. That was very nice. But it was marred by this sort of overly technical writing, which just completely destroyed it.
Alan?
I'd love to sound original, but I have to agree with that. I mean, I would so much rather have been watching Coronation Street than reading this book. It was quite unpickupable. I mean, it really was. It was impossible to visualize anything in this novel. I found it very hard to see any of the characters or to get engaged with them. I mean, again, it's a problem that the Atwood book suffers from. You have to care at some level about what is going on in a novel, and Azzopardi seems to neglect that. You don't care whether all the characters died on page 2 or indeed on page 50. It just doesn't grip in any way.
I've got to say that I thought it did pick up from around about that. I mean, the first 100 pages I was pulling my teeth out rather than read it, but after a page 100 something kind of clicked in. The voice and the mood of the piece and the story seemed to kind of start to coalesce. When it got to the present day, I found it much more interesting, and then of course it hits you with a really poor payoff. You get this kind of twist at the end, or it leaves you hanging at the end.
But there's a kind of arrogance about that in a way. If a book takes 100 pages to get you into it, what's that about, really? Yeah. I mean, it's
we've got busy lives.
Well,
exactly, I mean, what's going on?
Exactly. I mean, to be honest with you, and also it's her story. You can feel it. The book is just like this in your face the whole time, and she writes about things that I don't care about. She doesn't make me interested in them, which is why I'm saying it's very much a first book.
I think we will draw the curtains and say this is the first novel, and good luck with the next novel. I'm sure you all think that. As novelists,
absolutely.
Okay. Right, we go to the Deposition of Father McGreevy. Let's start with you, Alan. What did you think of this novel?
Again, extraordinary to find this on a Booker Prize shortlist. The author seemed to have put every cliche about Ireland into a box, shaken them all up, and spewed out this book. I mean, it's complete with priests, intrigues in the Catholic Church, village life. It even has sex with a sheep. Now, when I've been telling various people, this has got sex with sheep in it.
And a lamb.
Lamb.
No, both.
Oh, both lamb and sheep, exactly. You know, this should be great, but unfortunately the author manages to make even sex with sheep and lamb seem rather boring, which is an achievement, because that should be the kinky bit, but it just isn't. So extraordinarily dull and badly written. I don't know what it's doing.
You think what William Golding could have done with the same kind of material,
Absolutely.
or the same sort of ideas of evil and paganism, especially a book set during the war. I mean, I found it hard work. I found there was a kind of, again, I found it a very misogynistic book. All the women are killed off right at the start from some horrible disease, except for one old woman who's suspected of being a witch.
She's called the old biddy.
Absolutely.
And
her main role in the book is to actually, at one point in the book, go up to an imbecile and start hitting him over the penis with a spoon. And I thought, what's this all about? And of course, it was very badly dealt with people with mental deficiencies as well. I mean, this boy who trips over, who has an injury, the Amadan, as he's called, who has an injury and because of that starts slavering and running after the local wildlife. I mean, this is before Club 1830 was invented, fair enough, but I still found it rather ridiculous. I did like Father McGreevy, though. I liked his voice, and I did like the character, and I liked it when I was spending time with him.
But there, I mean, to the writer's credit, there are moments where he writes like an angel. He'll describe.
Don't write
well, they do actually. Like Ishiguro, for instance, he'll describe something. For instance, he described a tree as like a black exclamation point in the landscape. Even the sheep shagging bit at the beginning, when the priest sees it, he talks about it being some sort of monster, which is quite beautiful. But then it's around it is this very, very pedestrian, cliched story, which I did not believe.
Can I ask the three of you, first of all, I'm going to ask you who you bank on, who you think is winning each, but just first of all, generally, what do you think of the list as a whole? What does this tell you? What do you think of the lot? You got the books, you've read them, Alain?
I think it's a point that I mentioned earlier. They simply don't pay enough attention to the pleasure of the reader. I think part of writing a good novel is not simply introducing great themes, tackling big questions, etc. It's also about providing a very basic pleasure, which is what happens next, and I care about this story. And most of the novelists just don't do that.
They're all first-person narratives, which is interesting. They're also very safe books. They're very contained books, finished books. And I'm surprised that they went for that kind of thing. They're the kind of books that have a beginning and an end, and they're very boring.
Ian?
I don't think they're the best 6 books I've read this year, let's put it that way. But I'm pleased to have read them because it does give us a taste that here we are sitting in the crypt and this almost reads like the end of English literature.
Well, thank you very much for that.
From a crime writer, I can say that.
At least a couple of us prepared to assassinate you after the programme. OK, who do you think should be the winner? Quickly, Alan.
Should win it Ishiguro.
Ishiguro?
Ishiguro.
I would like to see Michael Collins win it.
Ishiguro, Michael Collins. And it seems that the chairman of the judges, Simon Jenkins, is about to announce the winner, so we'll go over to him now. Here's Simon Jenkins.
And come up with this sort of non-American English-speaking cosmopolis. We went on a voyage, a series of voyages. We found ourselves in Tasmania, Canada, China, Malta, and Ireland. Ireland has sort of squatters' rights over the Booker shortlist, you'll have noticed. We sailed with Matthew Kneale on a glorious voyage to Tasmania with his Manxman crew and crazy gang of scientific adventurers. We scrambled the hills of Kerry with Brian O'Doherty, looking at what I suppose must have been the last truly medieval settlement in the British Isles dying in the 1940s. We explored the Rust Belt of America with Michael Collins in a marvellous thriller with depths far greater than any thriller normally has. We roamed the docks of Cardiff with Trezza Azzopardi, watching her poignant tale of a young girl growing up in a desperately poor surroundings of that rather exotic British ghetto, Welsh Maltese Cardiff. I think it's the most beautiful account of poverty that I've read in any recent novel. We glimpsed Shanghai with Kazuo Ishiguro, applying his precision instrument to the half-life of Englishmen as he went on his great search for his parental roots in China. As he put it, chasing through long years the shadows of vanished parents. And we ducked as Margaret Atwood threw her famous paint pot at small-town Canada, a psychological thriller hidden within a saga, hidden within a history. Blind Assassin demonstrates, I think, the mature pessimism of age and does so brilliantly. It's not a sad book, but it is a sad book. And as she says in her conclusion, but in paradise, there'd be no stories because there are no journeys. If you knew what was going to happen, you'd never eat or drink or laugh or get up in the morning. You'd never love anyone ever again. You'd never dare. That's why I believe we read stories. I've come to love these books as friends over the past few months. I'll miss them. All of them are 6 glorious novels, but we had to choose one. And the winner of the first Booker Prize of the 21st century, for 3 times the bridesmaid, now the bride, Margaret Atwood.
Well, as the chairman said, shortlisted for the Booker before this time is lucky for Canadian writer Margaret Atwood. And surely this is not just a popular choice for the literary world, but also the reading public. This is Blind Assassin is already a bestseller. It's a beautifully written, complex thriller dealing with the hidden passions in a wealthy Toronto family between the wars. And in her long career, I think many consider this to be her best work.
I was so unprepared for this event that I didn't actually work up a speech. But let me say, first of all, thank you very much to all of the Booker people, and my sympathies are with the judges because I've just been a judge myself. And I will say thank you to my editors and publishers, Liz Calder and Bloomsbury, and to my agents, Vivian Schister and Diana McKay, and to Lenny Goodings, who is Virago. And I would like to say thank you also to my very, very first editor in England, who is Diana Athill, who was with Andre Deutsch way back in 1969 when they took a chance on a Canadian young person. So thank you, Diana, as well. And let me say also that it's been a pleasure to be on a shortlist with such good books and such good sports. We actually had fun at Hatchard's today, and that doesn't always happen. And I would like to say, Beryl Bainbridge, here's to you. You have now won our little bet as to which of us could be shortlisted the most times. And I will say also thank you, Angela Carter, who is with us in spirit, who always used to explain everything about England to me, and she was always right. And thank you, Robertson Davies, who is on the other hand up there. This is a prize about books and reading and writers and writing. It's not just about one book. I'm very honored to have it this year, but really it's about reading and writing. And lastly, I will just say there's an unknown writer out there who is writing next year's Booker right now. So good luck to you wherever you are.
Okay, very briefly, Alain Bontemps. You were wrong.
I was wrong. If you read one book this year, don't make it this one. Read the Ishiguro. I mean, she's a lovely lady. She's clearly great, but her book is really quite dull, so be careful with it.
This is a Lifetime Achievement Award, actually. This is not her best book. Her masterpiece is Alias Grace, but I'm very happy she's won it.
Yeah? Yeah, I'm happy she's won it. I kind of had a sneaking suspicion she might, although I would have liked the Collins to win.
So what's happened with you guys, really, is that you've been outboxed by the bookies.
Yes.
The bookies always know. The bookies always know.
They always know, you know. And
I just hope we get some contemporary British novels in next year's shortlist. I would love to see that.
I would like to see that as well.
Yeah. And I mean, as you say, it's a lifetime award.
Yes.
So good for her.
Yes, and she deserves it.
Yeah.
It was a gracious speech.
Absolutely.
It was very well done. I'm glad she mentioned Borough Bainbridge.
Yes.
And maybe next year we'll be celebrating Borough Bainbridge. Who knows who we'll be celebrating, but we haven't been celebrating quite as much as the Crypt as you would have liked us to, but there we are, the independent people. That's all from this year's Booker Prize, and from down here, thanks to Anna de Botton, Bonnie Gray and Ian Rankin, and from the Guildhall in London, goodbye.